your heart to be right, for you'll be criticized anyway. You'll be damned if you do and damned if you don't. That is her advice. When the late Matthew C. Brush was president of the American International Corporation, I asked him if he was ever sensitive to criticism, and he replied, "Yes, I was very sensitive to it in my early days. I was eager then to have all the employees in the organization think I was perfect. If they didn't, it worried me. I would try to please first one person who had been sounding off against me, but the very thing I did to patch it up with him would make someone else mad. Then when I tried to fix it up with this person, I would stir up a couple of other bumblebees. I finally discovered that the more I tried to pacify and to smooth over injured feelings in order to escape personal criticism, the more certain I was to increase my enemies. So finally I said to myself, if you get your head above the crowd, you're going to be criticized, so get used to the idea. That helped me tremendously. From that time on, I made it a rule to do the very best I could, and then put up my old umbrella and let the rain of criticism drain off me instead of run down my neck. Deems Taylor went a bit further. He let the rain of criticism run down his neck and had a good laugh over it, in public. He was giving his comments during the intermission of the Sunday afternoon radio concerts of the New York Philharmonic Symphony Orchestra. One woman wrote him a letter calling him a liar, a traitor, a snake, and a moron. Mr. Taylor says in his book, Of Men and Music, I have a suspicion that she didn't care for that talk. On the following week's broadcast, Mr. Taylor read this letter over the radio to millions of listeners, and received another letter from the same lady a few days later, expressing her unaltered opinion, says Mr. Taylor, that I was still a liar, a traitor, a snake, and a moron. We can't keep from admiring a man who takes criticism like that. We admire his serenity, his unshaken poise, and his sense of humor. When Charles Schwab was addressing the student body at Princeton, he confessed that one of the most important lessons he ever learned was taught to him by an old German who worked in Schwab's steel mill. This old German got involved in a hot wartime argument with the other steel workers, and they tossed him into the river. When he came into my office, Mr. Schwab said, covered with mud and water, I asked him what he had said to the men who had thrown him in the river, and he replied, I just laughed. Mr. Schwab declared that he had adopted that old German's words as his motto, just laugh. That motto is especially good when you're the victim of unjust criticism. You can answer the man who answers you back, but what can you say to the man who just laughs? Lincoln might have broken under the strain of the Civil War if he hadn't learned the folly of trying to answer all the vitriolic condemnation hurled at him. His description of how he handled his critics has become a literary gem, a classic. General MacArthur had a copy of it hanging above his headquarters desk during the war, and Winston Churchill had a framed copy of it on the walls of his study at Chartwell. It goes like this. If I were to try to read, much less to answer all the attacks made on me, this shop might as well be closed for any other business. I do the very best I know how, the very best I can, and I mean to keep on doing so until the end. If the end brings me out all right, then what is said against me won't matter. If the end brings me out wrong, then 10 angels swearing I was right would make no difference. When you and I are unjustly criticized, let's remember Rule 2. Do the very best you can, and then put up your old umbrella and keep the rain of criticism from running down the back of your neck. Chapter 22. Fool Things I Have Done. I have a folder in my private filing cabinet marked FTD, short for Fool Things I've Done. I put in that folder written records of the fool things I've been guilty of. I sometimes dictate these memos to my secretary, but sometimes they're so personal, so stupid, that I'm ashamed to dictate them, so I write them out in longhand. I can still recall some of the criticism of Dale Carnegie that I put in my FTD folder 15 years ago. If I'd been utterly honest with myself, I would now have a filing cabinet bursting out at the seams with these FTD memos. I can truthfully repeat what King Saul said 30 centuries ago. I have played the fool and have erred exceedingly. When I get out my FTD folders and reread the criticisms I have written of myself, they help me deal with the toughest problem I shall ever face, the management of Dale Carnegie. I used to blame my troubles on other people, but as I've grown older and wiser, I hope, I've realized that I myself, in the last analysis, am to blame for almost all my misfortunes. Lots of people have discovered that as they grow older. "No one but myself," said Napoleon at St. Helena. "No one but myself can be blamed for my fall. I have been my own greatest enemy, the cause of my own disastrous fate." Let me tell you about a man I knew who was an artist when it came to self-appraisal and self-management. His name was H.P. Howell. When the news of his sudden death in the drugstore of the Hotel Ambassador, New York, was flashed across the nation on July 31st, 1944, Wall Street was shocked, for he was the leader in American finance, chairman of the board of the Commercial National Bank and Trust Company, and a director of several large corporations. He grew up with little formal education, started out in life clerking in a country store, and later became credit manager for U.S. Steel, and was on his way to position and power. "For years I have kept an engagement book showing all the appointments I have during the day," Mr. Howell told me when I asked him to explain the reasons for his success. "My family never makes any plans for me on Saturday night, for the family knows that I devote a part of each Saturday evening to self-examination and a review and appraisal of my work during the week. After dinner, I go off by myself, open my engagement book, and think over all the interviews, discussions, and meetings that have taken place since Monday morning. I ask myself, what mistakes did I make that time? What did I do that was right? And in what way could I have improved my performance? What lesson can I learn from that experience? I sometimes find that this weekly review makes me very unhappy. Sometimes I'm astonished by my own blunders. Of course, as the years have gone by, these blunders have become less frequent. This system of self-analysis, continued year after year, has done more for me than any other thing I have ever attempted." Maybe H.P. Howell borrowed his idea from Ben Franklin. Only Franklin didn't wait until Saturday night. He gave himself a severe going-over every night. He discovered that he had 13 serious faults. Here are 3 of them: wasting time, stewing around over trifles, arguing and contradicting people. Wise old Ben Franklin realized that unless he eliminated these handicaps, he wasn't going to get very far. So he battled one of his shortcomings every day for a week and kept a record of who had won each day's slugging match. The next week, he would pick out another bad habit, put on the gloves, and when the bell rang, he would come out of his corner fighting. Franklin kept up this battle with his faults every week for more than 2 years. No wonder he became one of the best-loved and most influential men this nation ever produced. Elbert Hubbard said, "Every man is a damn fool for at least 5 minutes a day. Wisdom consists in not exceeding that limit." The small man flies into a rage over the slightest criticism, but the wise man is eager to learn from those who have censured him and reproved him and disputed the passage with him. Walt Whitman put it this way: "Have you learned only of those who admired you and were tender with you and stood aside for you? Have you not learned great lessons from those who rejected you and braced themselves against you or disputed the passage with you?" Instead of waiting for our enemies to criticize us or our work, let's beat them to it. Let's be our own most severe critic. Let's find and remedy all our weaknesses before our enemies get a chance to say a word. That is what Charles Darwin did. In fact, he spent 15 years criticizing, well, the story goes like this. When Darwin completed the manuscript of his immortal book, The Origin of Species, He realized that the publication of his revolutionary concept of creation would rock the intellectual and religious worlds, so he became his own critic and spent another 15 years checking his data, challenging his reasoning, criticizing his conclusions. Suppose someone denounced you as a mad fool. What would you do? Get angry? Indignant? Here's what Lincoln did. Edward M. Stanton, Lincoln's Secretary of War, once called Lincoln a damned fool. Stanton was indignant because Lincoln had been meddling in Stanton's affairs. In order to please a selfish politician, Lincoln had signed an order transferring certain regiments. Stanton not only refused to carry out Lincoln's orders, but swore that Lincoln was a damn fool for ever signing such orders. What happened? When Lincoln was told what Stanton had said, Lincoln calmly replied, "If Stanton said I am a damned fool, then I must be, for he is nearly always right. I'll just step over and see for myself." Lincoln did go to see Stanton. Stanton convinced him that the order was wrong, and Lincoln withdrew it. Lincoln welcomed criticism when he knew it was sincere, founded on knowledge, and given in a spirit of helpfulness. You and I ought to welcome that kind of criticism, too, for we can't even hope to be right more than 3 times out of 4. At least, that was all Theodore Roosevelt said he could hope for when he was in the White House. Einstein, the most profound thinker of our day, confessed that his conclusions were wrong 99% of the time. "The opinions of our enemies," said La Rochefoucauld, "come nearer to the truth about us than do our own opinions." I know that statement may be true many times, yet when anyone starts to criticize me, if I do not watch myself, I instantly and automatically leap to the defensive, even before I have the slightest idea of what my critic is going to say. I'm disgusted with myself every time I do it. We all tend to resent criticism and lap up praise, regardless of whether either the criticisms or the praise is justified. We are not creatures of logic. We're creatures of emotions. Our logic is like a birch-bark canoe tossed about on a deep, dark, stormy sea of emotion. If we hear that someone has spoken ill of us, let's not try to defend ourselves. Every fool does that. Let's be original and humble and brilliant. Let's confound our critic and win applause for ourselves by saying, "If my critic had known about all my other faults, he would have criticized me much more severely than he did." In previous chapters, I've talked about what to do when you're unjustly criticized. But here's another idea. When your anger is rising because you feel you've been unjustly condemned, why not stop and say, "Just a minute, I am far from perfect. If Einstein admits he is wrong 99% of the time, maybe I'm wrong at least 80% of the time. Maybe I deserve this criticism. If I do, I ought to be thankful for it and try to profit by it." Charles Luckman, a former president of the Pepsodent Company, spent $1 million a year putting Bob Hope on the air. He didn't look at the letters praising the program, but he insisted on seeing the critical letters. He knew he might learn something from them. The Ford Company was so eager to find out what was wrong with its management and operations that it polled the employees and invited them to criticize the company. I know a former soap salesman who used to even ask for criticism. When he first started out selling soap for Colgate, orders came slowly. He worried about losing his job. Since he knew there was nothing wrong with the soap or the price, he figured that the trouble must be himself. When he failed to make a sale, he would often walk around the block trying to figure out what was wrong. Had he been too vague? Did he lack enthusiasm? Sometimes he would go back to the merchant and say, "I haven't come back here to try to sell you any soap. I've come back to get your advice and your criticism. Won't you please tell me what I did that was wrong when I tried to sell